Okay, the Gato office was on Fulton County Airport, and my operation was on Fulton County Airport, so I knew him pretty well through his official capacity as supervisor of all our operation type thing. And he came to me and asked me to work with him on the flight test guide. I can't remember now in my mind. It's easy to slide these things. I don't really know whether he started the flight test guide or I did, but it's a kind of a blurred image between the two of us. I know both of us worked on it. He had the authority of the FAA behind him, and I had nothing except my own ideas. But together I can say we developed and refined the flight test guide and published it. He wrote what we'd done to Washington and sent to him, and they actually published the flight test guide by the FAA for the first time. And then it started getting widely distributed over the whole country and became, and still is today, the standard of the measurement, the criteria of how you judge whether a pilot has reached the proper level of training at the private pilot level. And then that was a private pilot was the first one. Then today there's a flight test guide for every rating. Private pilot, commercial pilot, instrument, multi-engine, ATP, type ratings for bigger airplanes, all as a flight test guide now for each one of those things to tell the examiner who actually does a flight check and issues the license or doesn't, tell him exactly what his criteria and limits are and what he can do and what he should do and what he shouldn't do. And it's been very successful over these years. It was a very good move because the regulations as they're written and are written today are not very helpful. Somebody has to use a good bit of imagination and has a lot of leeway to do it good or bad. Mm-hmm. But the flight test guide kind of straightens that out and has been very successful at doing so for developing pilots. It lets the individual, such as yourself or anybody who wants to be a private pilot, can look at the flight test guide and see exactly what he has to do and how he's got to do it, how he has to do each thing. It says, for instance, on landing, for a private pilot, he has to land on or beyond, I believe in those days it was 200 feet, and I just noticed the other day, I was reading some magazine, it's been enlarged to 400 feet, but it still specifies the result of the landing has to be a good landing and properly speed-wise and everything, and it has to accomplish within the touchdown within that space. Mm-hmm. I remember one of my, before the flight test guide came out, another FA man named Seidel was in that same Gato office, and they, in those days they would come around to your airport and check your students. And I had a student who I had worked awful hard with, and named Drew, and he was ready for his check ride, and this inspector scheduled it with us, came around, and they took off and flew for a good long time, as I remember thinking about it. They'd been gone plenty long, get a job, and they came into the field, made their landings, and then taxied in. And when the airplane stopped, the student got out this side, and the FAA guy got out that side, and they both went straight to the cars. Then I was up here at the office waiting on them. They went straight to the cars, didn't speak to me. And I rushed out there and got hold of the FAA guy and said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Well, that guy's just a hard-headed poor student. He can't fly," or something like that. I don't remember what he said, but it was very dissatisfactory. And I said, "Wait a minute. Let me find out what's wrong here. I know this guy. The student was an older guy. He was probably 50 or 55 years old at that time. Mm-hmm. And I was 22. So there were older people dealing with it. And I had worked, the student Drew had, I think he had 70 hours at that time, and the minimum was 40. So we had worked an awful lot on him. And I had gone through a thing with him. I remembered when he first started flying, he bought an airplane, a Stinson 105, and he flew it a few hours and with a friend of his who had been in the military, been an Army pilot, and he was flying around our field and keeping it there. He came up one day and said, my friend's quit, he won't fly with me anymore. Will you fly with me? I got an airplane, I want to learn to fly now. I made up my mind, I want to do it. And I said, sure. So I jumped in the airplane with him, and we flew for an hour or two, no more than that. We flew 8 or 10 hours together, and I finally did him like that other guy I was talking about. I said, Drew, we got to talk about this. You're just not doing well at all. And he said, well, are you going to quit flying with me? And I said, well, yeah, you're just paying me to help you, and I can't help you. It doesn't seem like I'm helping you. And he said, let me think about it. And so he came back a day or two, said, I'm going to do this. I got that airplane, I'm going to do it. So you don't worry about me paying you. I'll pay you, and we'll get this job done. And then, as I've already said, he got to 40. He wasn't anywhere near ready for his private license. We got to 70. And I have to say, without reservation, he was as good as anybody who achieved that level, that hour level and competency level, and as good as anybody ever had. He was really good. And so then he took his check ride that day, got hold of him, and went up to the office and made this FAA guy come in there and sit down. And I said, now let's really talk this out and find out what's wrong. What are you unhappy about? And he said, came down to just one thing, the accuracy landings. He said, I had gone out there before we flew, and I put the 2 runway markers. They were about 6 feet long and a V like this, made out of wood painted white, for markers on the side of the runway. And I put 2 of them down there 200 feet apart, down near the end of the runway. And I told Drew, when we took off and came back, I wanted to land within that space. And we got back, and he came around and landed the first time and missed. The next thing to tell you is that day he had been flying, Drew had been practicing very strong winds for a month or more. I don't know what period of time it was, Georgia, but there were winds. And this day turned out to be just dead calm. And Drew had overshot the runway, the marker, and landed. They landed, good landing, but overshot the space. And so I said, Drew, did you overshoot the space? And he said, yes. And then I asked the guy first, did he overshoot the space? He said, yeah. I said, Drew, did you overshoot the space? Yeah. And Drew said, wait a minute, though. I want to tell you why. So this guy, is pointing to the FAA guy, he was telling me how to do it, and I knew how to do it, and he was telling me something I didn't want to do it that way. That wasn't the way I do it. And I asked Seidel, that's what it is. He says, yeah. I told him, I said, he's got a 105 with flaps. See, he wasn't using the flaps properly. And I was telling him how to do it. I said, well, you got to give him the opportunity to do it his way, because that's our job, is how he does it, technique and all that, unless it's dangerous or something. And I turned to Drew and I said, well, if you can use the flaps the way you want to, can you land within that space? Drew said, absolutely, no problem. And I turned to the Seidel and I said, well, he says he can do it if you're going to let him do it. And he said, I'll give a chance. Said, I tell you what I'll do. He can go up by himself, and we'll watch him on the ground here, and if he can land a good land in that space 3 times, then I'll give him his license. And I asked Drew, no problem. He jumped in his airplane by himself, went up. In those days, it was a 180 side approach with a power cut opposite the spot and a circle as you want to play it around, and flaps or things like that. The power didn't matter, just had to land in that place. And no, it was power off all the way. You couldn't use any power once you got the power. Drew went up and came around and cut the power and landed right in the middle of it. Spot, took off, went around again, right in the middle. 3rd time around, right, did same place every time. And taxied in, and Seidel sat down at the desk, wrote out a license, signed his name, and handed it to me, and turned around and got in his car and left. Didn't even speak to me anymore. He was so mad. He was just sure that was a student's fault. And so Drew went out there and did it fine, and he was embarrassed by that misjudgment or whatever you want to call it on his part.